The factory floor was already a graveyard before the first Russian vehicle crossed the threshold. Concrete pillars, some still standing, most collapsed into angular rubble fields that narrowed the available lanes to barely 4 meters wide in places. Twisted rebar jutted from broken slabs at angles that made reversing a tracked vehicle a geometric puzzle under ideal conditions. These were not ideal conditions. It was early summer 2024, the Vovchansk factory district in Kharkiv Oblast, and 13 Russian armored vehicles were about to discover that the 92nd Assault Brigade had spent weeks turning this specific stretch of industrial ruin into a box with no exit. Over the next 30 minutes, we are going to reconstruct that engagement, vehicle by vehicle, position by position, using geolocated drone footage, burn pattern analysis, and the building-by-building topography of a factory block that Ukraine's defenders had studied far longer than their attackers. This is not a story about Ukrainian luck. It is a story about geometry, patience, and the systematic transformation of urban rubble into a weapons system. The question at the center of this episode is not simply how 13 vehicles were stopped. It is why Russian armored doctrine keeps feeding columns into exactly this kind of terrain, and what the 92nd Assault Brigade understood about that pattern before the column even moved. By the time we finish, you will see that the factory engagement at Vovchansk was not an ambush in the conventional sense. It was a designed environment, and the Russians drove into it voluntarily. Vovchansk sits roughly 6 kilometers from the Russian border in Kharkiv Oblast, straddling the Vovcha River along a transport axis that has strategic significance well beyond the town's modest peacetime population of 15,000. Russia launched its second major push into northern Kharkiv in May 2024, crossing the border with combined arms formations and attempting to establish a buffer zone that would, in Moscow's stated framing, prevent Ukrainian artillery from ranging Russian territory. The real operational logic was more ambitious: threaten Kharkiv city itself from the north, force Ukraine to strip defenders from other axes, and potentially sever the M03 highway corridor. Ukrainian forces under the Kharkiv Defense Grouping, which included the 92nd Assault Brigade as a primary maneuver element, absorbed the initial Russian push with calculated depth. Rather than contest every meter of open ground where Russian artillery and glide bombs held a structural advantage, Ukrainian units traded space at the border for the chance to channel Russian forces deeper into the urban fabric of Vovchansk, where those advantages shrank and Ukrainian anti-tank capabilities grew proportionally stronger. By early June 2024, the front line inside Vovchansk had stabilized along a ragged east-west axis running through the industrial quarter on the town's eastern edge. The factory district was the contested center of gravity. On satellite imagery from that period, the area appears as a dense grid of large footprint industrial buildings, separated by narrow service roads and loading corridors, with rail spurs cutting diagonally through the layout. The buildings themselves were in various states of structural damage from months of bombardment, but their footprint remained largely intact, creating a three-dimensional maze of enclosed spaces, partial walls, and rubble fields that made overhead observation extremely difficult and direct fire engagement nearly impossible beyond line-of-sight ranges measured in tens of meters rather than kilometers. Russia's objective in this sector was straightforward on paper: push through the factory district, seize a series of buildings on the western edge, and establish firing positions that would threaten Ukrainian logistics routes running north of the city center. What Russian planners appear to have underestimated, based on the subsequent engagement, was the degree to which the 92nd Assault Brigade had converted the factory district from a defended position into a prepared killing ground. Here is the tactical comparison that determined the outcome before the first round was fired. Russia brought armor into a space where armor's advantages, range, firepower, protection, are all neutralized by geometry. Ukraine brought anti-tank guided missile teams, FPV drone operators, and a detailed mental map of every choke point in a 200-meter stretch of factory corridor. Russia had force mass. Ukraine had positional intelligence. In this specific terrain, positional intelligence was worth more than 20 additional vehicles. Let us look at what Ukrainian forces actually knew and had prepared before the Russian column moved. Open-source footage from the Vovchansk factory district, geolocated by analysts, including those at the Conflict Intelligence Team and Ukrainian OSINT communities, shows a consistent pattern in the weeks preceding the engagement. Ukrainian FPV operators were flying reconnaissance missions through the factory corridors, building a frame-by-frame picture of the available lanes, the sight lines from each building position, and the locations where a tracked vehicle could and could not maneuver once committed to a specific corridor. This was not casual reconnaissance. The footage shows methodical grid-by-grid coverage of the industrial block, with operators noting structural features, debris fields, and the specific angles at which the rubble created natural funnels. Forward observers from the 92nd Assault Brigade reported multiple Russian vehicle movements near the factory district's eastern approaches in the days before the main engagement. Intercepted communications, referenced in Ukrainian military briefings at the time, indicated Russian unit commanders were discussing a push through what they described as the industrial corridor as a route to bypass more heavily defended street-level positions to the north. Ukrainian intelligence understood the likely axis before the column formed up. Anti-tank teams were pre-positioned accordingly. Based on drone footage of the aftermath and the geometry of the burn patterns visible in later satellite imagery, Ukrainian crews established at least 3 distinct firing positions covering overlapping sectors of the main factory corridor. One position appears to have been established inside a partially collapsed building on the northern side of the corridor, with a direct sight line to the corridor's entry point approximately 80 meters away. A second position was set back approximately 120 meters along the corridor's length, covering the midsection where the lane narrowed between 2 intact building facades. A third position, used predominantly by FPV operators rather than ATGM crews, appears to have been elevated, possibly on a second-floor remnant of a building on the corridor's southern side, giving operators a near-vertical attack angle on vehicles directly below. This positioning reflects a principle that experienced urban warfare commanders describe as dead zone architecture. You do not place your anti-tank weapons where they can be seen and engaged at range. You place them where they can engage only after the target has already committed past the point where retreat becomes more dangerous than advancing. The first vehicle in the Russian column had to travel approximately 40 meters into the corridor before any of these positions had a clean shot. By the time the firing started, the vehicles behind the lead element had already begun entering the corridor themselves, compressing the column into a space where reversing under fire was geometrically constrained by the rubble fields on either side. What's most surprising about this engagement when you map it against standard Russian armored doctrine is not that the ambush worked. It's that the column entered the corridor without apparent dismounted infantry screening the route ahead of the vehicles. The absence of foot soldiers moving in advance of the armor is visible in the early drone footage of the engagement. The lead vehicle, subsequently identified in open-source analysis as a BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle, appears to be moving with its hatches closed and without infantry visible on the flanks or in front. This is the single tactical decision that transformed a dangerous ambush into a catastrophic one. Dismounted infantry screening serves a specific function in urban terrain. Soldiers on foot can detect anti-tank positions, tripwires, and drone operators before the vehicles they are screening enter the effective engagement zone. They can identify rubble field geometry that would trap a tracked vehicle. They provide early warning that allows the column to halt before committing. Without them, the vehicles are essentially blind past their optical sensors, which in the narrow, visually cluttered environment of a factory district provide almost no useful forward observation. Russian sources in the period following the engagement offered various explanations for the absence of infantry screening, ranging from claims that dismounts had been killed in earlier fighting to suggestions that the corridor had been assessed as clear by prior reconnaissance. Open-source evidence does not support the cleared corridor assessment. Ukrainian FPV footage from before the engagement clearly shows the corridor was not empty of defensive preparation. Now the column moves. The lead BMP-3 enters the factory corridor from the eastern approach at a speed consistent with a cautious advance, perhaps 10 to 15 kilometers per hour. Behind it, based on the subsequent drone footage showing vehicle positions in the corridor, at least 2 additional armored vehicles follow at close interval, consistent with a column moving in the expectation that the lead element will push through and that speed will reduce exposure time. This logic works in open terrain where a faster-moving vehicle is a harder target. In a corridor 40 meters wide at its widest point, with rubble reducing available lane width to 4 meters in places, speed does not reduce exposure time in any meaningful way. It reduces the time available to detect and react to a threat. The lead vehicle passes the 40-meter mark. The first Ukrainian ATGM team fires. The missile used in this engagement, based on visual analysis of the launch signature in Ukrainian drone footage, appears consistent with a Ukrainian-operated NLAW or a Stugna-P anti-tank missile system, the latter being a Ukrainian-developed laser-guided weapon with a range of up to 5 kilometers and a tandem warhead capable of defeating vehicles with explosive reactive armor. At 40 meters inside a factory corridor, the range advantage of the Stugna-P is irrelevant. What matters is the tandem warhead and the firing position angle, which in the footage appears to be a slight downward trajectory, suggesting the crew was firing from an elevated position and targeting the vehicle's roof armor, which is substantially thinner than its frontal arc. The lead vehicle stops. It does not reverse. The footage shows it settling forward, which is consistent with catastrophic mobility damage, likely a track system strike or a kill to the engine compartment. In a corridor of this width, a disabled vehicle in the lead position has just sealed the corridor for every vehicle behind it. And here is where the geometry becomes decisive. The second vehicle in the column, now approximately 15 meters behind the disabled lead element, cannot pass to the left because of a rubble field that eliminates that lane. It cannot pass to the right because of an intact building facade. It cannot reverse at useful speed because the vehicles behind it have closed the distance and are now themselves inside the corridor. The column is fixed, not by Ukrainian firepower alone, by physics. The second ATGM engagement occurs within an estimated 45 to 90 seconds of the first, based on the timing visible in drone footage. The third vehicle is struck within the first 3 minutes. At this point, 2 things are compounding the disaster for the Russian column. First, the intact vehicles in the corridor cannot fire back effectively because they cannot identify the firing positions. The ATGM crews and FPV operators are concealed in the rubble and building remnants, and the enclosed geometry means that muzzle flash and launch signatures are suppressed by the surrounding structure. Second, the smoke from burning vehicles is rapidly filling the corridor, further reducing the optical capability of Russian crews attempting to locate the threat. The FPV operators enter the engagement at this stage. This is where the 3-dimensional nature of the Ukrainian defensive setup becomes critical. FPV drones carrying RPG-7 warheads or purpose-built shaped charge payloads do not need line of sight in the conventional sense. They can fly over the burning lead vehicles, turn, and engage targets from above and behind. Footage from the Vovchansk factory engagement shows this exact attack geometry. FPV drones approaching from the western end of the corridor, behind the Ukrainian positions, flying low along the building facades to avoid Russian handheld air defense, then descending steeply onto vehicle roof surfaces. The roof armor of a BMP series vehicle runs between 15 and 25 millimeters of steel. An RPG-7 warhead generating over 500 millimeters of penetration behind its shaped charge jet will defeat this protection with significant margin. For drone-delivered variants, the attack angle allows the warhead to strike exactly the surface most vulnerable to this attack mode. Put yourself in the position of a Russian vehicle commander in the fourth or fifth vehicle of this column. You cannot move forward because the corridor ahead is filling with burning wreckage. You cannot reverse because vehicles are behind you. You cannot fire effectively because you cannot locate the threat. Your radios may or may not be functioning inside the enclosed concrete structure. Your instinct is to button up and call for help. But calling for help requires a clear radio link that the factory building mass may be degrading. And help, in the form of Russian artillery or aviation, cannot engage inside a corridor where Russian and Ukrainian positions are separated by meters. Fire support is unavailable precisely because of the geometry that was supposed to give the armored column its advantage. We dug through the available drone footage from this engagement and cross-referenced it with Ukrainian OSINT community mapping, and one detail kept pressing itself forward as significant. The timing of the FPV strikes relative to the ATGM strikes is not random. The FPV operators appear to have waited until ATGM fire had immobilized at least 2 vehicles and begun filling the corridor with smoke before launching their own attacks. This sequencing is tactically deliberate. The smoke provides concealment for the FPV approach run. The immobilized vehicles at the corridor entry create a physical barrier that ensures no remaining Russian vehicle can exit while the FPV strikes are ongoing. The ATGM fire and the drone attacks are not parallel events happening simultaneously. They are sequenced to compound each other's effect. This is not a spontaneous response to a Russian attack. This is a rehearsed fire plan. By the point the engagement has been running for approximately 8 minutes, based on timeline reconstruction from the drone footage timestamps, 5 vehicles have been struck and are no longer mobile. The remaining vehicles in the corridor are in various states of attempted reaction. Some appear to be attempting reverse maneuver. Some have stopped and buttoned up. At least one appears to have attempted to push through the burning lead vehicles, which is a tactically understandable but physically impossible response given the height of the burning wreckage. If you've ever tried to back a vehicle in a narrow space while someone is actively shooting at you, with smoke filling your vision and debris under your tracks, you begin to understand why the Russian crews who survived this engagement made decisions that look incorrect in retrospect. They were not making decisions from a position of information. They were reacting to immediate threats with no useful situational awareness of the overall geometry. The engagement extends through approximately 25 minutes of active firing, again based on footage timestamps, before Ukrainian forces shift to an observation and cleanup mode, with FPV operators tracking remaining mobile vehicles as they attempt to withdraw from the eastern approach of the corridor. Of the vehicles that entered the factory corridor itself, the open-source confirmed loss count stands at 9 vehicles destroyed or abandoned in place, with 4 additional vehicles struck while attempting withdrawal from the approach road outside the corridor proper, for a combined total consistent with the 13-vehicle figure referenced in Ukrainian military reporting. The specific vehicle types identified in open-source imagery of the aftermath include BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, at least 1 BTR-82A armored personnel carrier, and what appears to be a T-72B3 main battle tank in the column's rear element that was struck during the withdrawal attempt on the approach road rather than inside the corridor itself. The tank's loss is worth noting because it reflects a second tactical failure compounding the first. The rear security element, which in a well-planned urban assault would maintain covering positions while forward elements engage, instead advanced into the corridor approach when the lead elements became engaged, leaving itself exposed to Ukrainian drone attack at ranges where a tank's armor advantage provides minimal benefit against a top-attack FPV strike. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback. Russia's problem at Vovchansk is not incompetent soldiers. It is a command culture that consistently prioritizes momentum over position clearing and a planning process that assesses terrain from overhead imagery rather than from ground-level reconnaissance by the units who will actually traverse it. The soldiers driving those vehicles were following orders from commanders who had calculated the risk of that corridor based on information that was either wrong or incomplete. The soldiers paid the price for the commander's calculation. That is a systemic failure, not an individual one, and it recurs across dozens of documented engagements in the Kharkiv axis because the command culture that produced the failure has not been corrected by the losses. At this point, with roughly half of the available footage and documentation reviewed, we need to step back and ask a question that the Ukrainian side would be the first to acknowledge. The 92nd Assault Brigade executed this ambush with high precision. But precision engagements require preparation time, good intelligence, and the freedom to pre-position assets. All three of those prerequisites depend on the enemy being predictable enough to set up against. Why does Russian armored doctrine in urban terrain remain predictable enough to ambush? If you have been following this front seriously, drop your theory in the comments. The answer matters for how we think about the rest of the Kharkiv axis fighting. The answer that the OSINT record suggests is this. Russian battalion and company commanders in the Vovchansk sector are operating under significant top-down pressure to produce territorial gains on a timeline that does not allow for the kind of deliberate clearing operations that urban terrain requires. Clearing a factory district building by building, with dismounted infantry supported by armor at standoff, rather than armor leading dismounted infantry, requires time measured in days and weeks. Russian operational timelines in this period were measured in hours. The pressure to show results translates into commanders accepting higher immediate risk rather than the slower methodical risk of a proper urban clearance, because the slower method does not produce the daily progress reports that higher headquarters demands. Ukrainian brigade-level commanders understood this pressure existed. Forward observers and intercepted communications gave Ukrainian forces a reasonable model of when Russian commanders would choose speed over caution. The factory district ambush was set up precisely because the 92nd Assault Brigade's intelligence picture told them a push through the industrial corridor was likely on a compressed timeline. The geometry of the ambush was not designed to stop a deliberate Russian clearance operation. It was designed to stop exactly the kind of opportunistic armored push that time pressure tends to produce. Here is what this tells us about the broader pattern of Kharkiv axis fighting. Ukraine's operational advantage in urban terrain is not primarily a technology advantage, though FPV drones are a significant tactical tool. It is an information advantage. Ukrainian units defending the Vovchansk district had a more accurate model of Russian intentions and capabilities than Russian units had of Ukrainian defensive preparation. That information asymmetry, combined with the physical properties of factory district terrain, produced an outcome that would have looked identical whether Ukraine's anti-tank weapons were Stugna P systems, NLAWs, or Javelins. The weapon system mattered less than the knowledge of where to place it and when. This is a conclusion that should matter to NATO military planners as much as it matters to Ukrainian brigade commanders. The lesson of Vovchansk is not specifically about FPV drones or ATGMs. It is about the relationship between intelligence preparation of the battlefield and defensive effectiveness in complex terrain. Urban industrial terrain is a force multiplier for any defender who has had time to study and prepare it, and a force divider for any attacker who enters it without ground-level reconnaissance, and a command culture that allows for deliberate clearance over compressed timelines. One detail from the Vovchansk engagement stuck with us through repeated review of the footage, and it is worth naming directly because it does not fit the standard narrative of the fighting in this period. In the drone footage from the middle of the engagement, when 3 or 4 vehicles are already burning and the remaining column elements are attempting various responses, there is a brief sequence, perhaps 12 seconds, showing a single Russian soldier exiting a vehicle hatch and attempting to move along the building wall to the north of the corridor. He is not engaging anyone. He is trying to find a firing position that gives him a view of the Ukrainian positions. He does not succeed before the drone operators shift their focus to the vehicles, and the footage does not show his ultimate fate. But the attempt matters as an observation. Someone in that column understood what needed to happen. That soldier's instinct to get dismounted infantry into the fight in a role that could locate and engage the Ukrainian positions was exactly correct. His commanders had not built that capacity into the plan before the column moved, and correcting that failure under fire, inside a burning corridor, was functionally impossible. The battle damage assessment of the Vovchansk factory engagement, as compiled from Ukrainian General Staff reporting and cross-referenced with Oryx open-source data and geolocated footage analysis, puts the confirmed vehicle losses in this engagement at 9 armored vehicles destroyed in place inside the corridor and its immediate approach, with 4 additional vehicles assessed as damaged or abandoned during withdrawal. At replacement cost for BMP-3 variants of approximately $3 to $4 million per unit, and T-72B3 variants at approximately $2 million in Russian production cost accounting, the material loss in this single engagement represents somewhere between $25 and $40 million in equipment, not including crew losses, which Ukrainian reporting describes as significant, but which open-source data cannot independently quantify at individual level. The strategic cost exceeds the material accounting. Russian reporting on the Vovchansk sector in the aftermath of this engagement, reconstructed from Telegram channels associated with Russian nationalist mill bloggers who are generally critical of Russian military performance, describes the loss as a significant setback to the effort to push through the factory district. Russian mill blogger commentary in this period, which functions as an unofficial but often accurate indicator of Russian military frustration, used language consistent with disrupted operational planning. References to the Axis being blocked, requests for additional assets before any further push, and criticism of the planning process that sent armor into the corridor without adequate reconnaissance. The operational ripple effect is visible in the subsequent timeline of Russian activity in the Vovchansk factory district. Following the engagement, satellite imagery and Ukrainian reporting indicate a significant reduction in Russian armored activity in the specific corridor used in the ambush, with Russian forces shifting their pressure to adjacent axes where the terrain geometry was assessed as more favorable. That shift itself is a Ukrainian tactical success. It forced Russian forces to abandon the shortest route through the factory district and take longer, more exposed approach routes that were already covered by Ukrainian defensive preparation. The ambush did not merely destroy 13 vehicles. It restructured the Russian approach to the entire factory district sector for a period of weeks. There is a historical parallel worth noting here, not as a comfortable analogy, but as a genuine structural comparison. In the urban fighting in Hue City during the 1968 Tet Offensive, American and South Vietnamese forces learned through painful experience that armored vehicles operating without adequate dismounted infantry in dense urban terrain produced predictable and catastrophic losses to defenders using anti-tank weapons in prepared positions. The lessons of Hue were incorporated into American urban warfare doctrine and are explicitly referenced in doctrine documents that have been part of NATO training curricula for decades. The question is not whether those lessons are known. They are known. The question is whether command cultures under operational pressure actually apply them when the pressure to show progress overrides the principle of deliberate clearance. At Vovchansk, Russian command culture answered that question in the way that the 92nd Assault Brigade's planners had anticipated it would. Think about that structural repetition. Similar failures in urban armored operations have recurred across conflicts spanning 60 years. In Hue, in Grozny, in 1994, in Fallujah, and now in Vovchansk, and dozens of other Ukrainian urban engagements. Does the historical record suggest that command cultures under pressure can actually learn and apply these lessons in real time? Or does the pressure itself reliably produce the same error? Leave your read on that in the comments. It is a question worth taking seriously, and the Vovchansk record is one data point among many. What the 92nd Assault Brigade demonstrated in the Vovchansk factory district is something that will likely be studied in military education curricula for some time. Not because it was a novel tactical idea, The pre-positioned ATGM ambush with coordinated drone follow-up is not new in principle, but because it was executed with a precision and a sequencing that reflects a significant maturation in how Ukrainian assault brigades integrate different weapons capabilities into a unified fire plan at company and battalion level. The coordination between the ATGM crews and the FPV operators, the deliberate use of initial ATGM strikes to generate screening smoke for the drone approach runs, the selection of firing positions that covered mutually supporting sectors with overlapping engagement zones. All of this reflects a level of tactical integration that represents a qualitative shift from Ukrainian capabilities in the early months of the full-scale invasion. In 2022, Ukrainian anti-tank defense was frequently effective but episodic. An operator with a Javelin or NLAW finding a shot of opportunity, a drone team striking a vehicle that strayed into their patrol area. By mid-2024, what the Vovchansk footage shows is something closer to a synchronized weapons system, where the human operators are functioning as components of an integrated fire plan rather than independent actors seeking individual targets. The factory district engagement lasted roughly 25 minutes of active fire. During that time, the Ukrainian defenders executed what the footage suggests was a pre-planned engagement sequence with minimal deviation from the anticipated scenario, because the scenario had been anticipated correctly. This capacity to predict how Russian forces will respond to a given terrain feature under operational pressure, and to build a fire plan designed to exploit that predictable response, is not a technology product. It is a product of 18 months of intensive combat experience, careful documentation of Russian behavioral patterns, and a Ukrainian military institutional culture that has developed the organizational frameworks for sharing that learning across units. The 92nd Assault Brigade did not discover the principle of the urban armored ambush. They had the intelligence preparation to know where to set it, the tactical skill to execute it, and the experience to sequence it correctly. Could Russia have prevented this outcome? The answer, based on the record, is yes, through several specific decision points that were accessible before the column moved. A proper ground-level reconnaissance of the factory corridor by dismounted infantry before the armored push would have located at least some of the Ukrainian firing positions. A command decision to clear the factory district by deliberate building-by-building infantry clearance, with armor in support at standoff rather than leading, would have eliminated the corridor geometry that made the ambush possible. A shift in operational timeline that allowed for adequate preparation rather than the compressed push that the engagement evidence suggests was attempted would have changed the risk calculus for the column commanders. None of these changes would have been easy given the command and resource pressures Russian battalion commanders were operating under. But all of them were within the realm of the tactically possible. The Vovchansk engagement was not inevitable. It was a product of specific decisions made at specific levels of command, under specific pressures, that produced a predictable outcome in a terrain environment that punishes exactly the tactical approach Russia chose. How does this change the defensive calculus for the Kharkiv axis going forward? Ukrainian commanders have now demonstrated, in multiple engagements through the Vovchansk period, that the factory district and urban industrial terrain more broadly can be held by relatively small, well-prepared forces against significantly larger Russian armored elements, provided that the defenders have the intelligence preparation, the weapons integration, and the time to convert the terrain into the kind of designed defensive environment that the 92nd Assault Brigade constructed. That lesson is not lost on Russian planning, and the pressure to find an approach to Vovchansk that does not repeat the factory corridor engagement is visible in the subsequent tactical pattern. What Russian forces have not yet demonstrated is the command flexibility to shift from the momentum-first doctrine to the deliberate clearance doctrine without the kind of top-down pressure that reliably overrides tactical judgment in the field. What is the next Ukrainian target in the Kharkiv direction? And will Russian forces see the preparation in time to change their approach? Those are questions the open-source record cannot yet answer. But the Vovchansk factory engagement gives us a framework for thinking about how Ukrainian defensive planning in this theater operates, and the answer suggests that any Russian armored formation approaching urban industrial terrain on the Kharkiv axis should assume that the geometry has already been studied, the fire positions already selected, and the engagement sequence already rehearsed. The factory was already a trap before the first vehicle arrived. The 92nd Assault Brigade simply waited for the column to drive into it. If this kind of engagement reconstruction, built from geolocated footage, burn pattern analysis, and tactical geometry, is the approach to the war you want to follow each week, subscribe to Frontline Truth. We do this kind of OSINT-grounded investigation every week, for the engagements that matter and the lessons that the standard coverage tends to miss. The Kharkiv axis is still moving. We will be watching it closely.